Hello, everyone. And to those who have come from outside, welcome to ISAS. We are here today to discuss what SAARC can learn from ASEAN with Professor Harsh Mahaseth of Jindal Global Law School in India. If you would just permit me to make a very cliched observation, which is that if we had gone back in time to the time of decolonization, and you had pointed to two sets of countries, the 8 who make up SAARC or the 11, now 11, who make up ASEAN, and you had said which of these look more likely to actually be able to build a functioning regional organization, actually overcome parochial nationalist interest for long-term regional cooperation, I think it would have been an obvious bet to make it on South Asia, not on Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia was a bunch of disparate countries with much of disconnected history, very different political trajectories, part of different empire, institutional incompatibility, and very little cultural intercourse, especially at the scope that Southeast Asia is. And yet, even the term Southeast Asia didn't come about till Second World War, and till 1960s, nobody could tell you who belonged to Southeast Asia. And yet, ASEAN today is an extremely functional organization. Perhaps it is one of the most successful regional organizations in the world. And given the fact that it has not had a Brexit, you can make a case by at least one measure, it is more successful even than EU. And it has also been a fulcrum of larger Asian or regionalism. It has been a fulcrum through ASEAN +3, through East Asia Summit, through RCEP. And meanwhile, the South Asian story we all know, the shared culture, the shared history, the institutional similarities, all of it with shared people, essentially one people. There was, at the time of decolonization, in fact, it was very difficult to imagine the region not having regionalism. If you think about the partition discourse around partition, much of the plans that were proposed, the cabinet mission plan, the Joint Defense Council, the tripartite India-Pakistan-Burma system that was imagined, all of these are essentially some ways of thinking about regionalism, a regional organization of some sort. And South Asia was also not a term that came into vogue till 1970s, and not because there was no conception of South Asia, but because the conception of South Asia was so obvious, it didn't need a term like South Asia. It was just Indian subcontinent that sufficed. And yet we today are in a situation where it is the least integrated region in the world, which is something that we keep on repeating over and over again: militarized borders, very ridiculously high trade barriers, and very little, abysmally low intergovernmental cooperation. And clearly, despite all of this, I think that after 70 years, enough people in South Asia are not convinced of the value of regionalism in South Asia, even though I think that the value is obvious for all countries involved. For India, India's rise, I think, will not be possible unless it takes its neighbors along with it. For Pakistan, yesterday we discussed the idea of Pakistan facing security challenges on both on its eastern and western borders. And the easiest way to ease that pressure is to encourage greater regionalism. And for smaller countries in South Asia, the easiest way to overcome their institutional limitation of their state capacity is to lean on a robust regional organization. Despite all this, South Asian regionalism remains abysmal. And so I think it's a really important question, and we are really delighted to welcome Professor Harsh Mahaseth to discuss this issue with us. He's the Associate Professor in Jindal Global Law School and a visiting faculty at Nalsa University of Law. He is also the Associate Director of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at Jindal. And we are really fortunate to have him as an academic visitor for the last couple of weeks. His work really is at the intersection of both IR and law, and which is very important. Why I'm really looking forward to this talk, because us in international relations side of research often forget how important the international law and international institutional rules are. So I'll now turn over to Harsh for his talk.
Okay. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Dr. Bharadwaj. And thank you everyone for joining us for this seminar. Good afternoon to all of you, and thank you so much to the Institute of South Asian Studies for hosting this seminar. So today's seminar is not about lamenting SAARC's failures, or it's not about celebrating ASEAN's model as a success. What I wanted to do actually was look at ASEAN as a mirror and then reflect back on SAARC's design choice and its political constraints as well as its institutional blind spots. So this was the abstract that I had submitted. And the argument that I wanted to develop was that SAARC did not fail because of South Asia being uniquely conflict-ridden. It failed because it institutionalized conflict avoidance rather than conflict management. And that is what I wanted to focus on. And to begin with that, first, we have to look at why I'm looking at SAARC and ASEAN and understand why even a comparison between the two is important. And I believe that it is important because there are far more similarities than we actually think there are between the two regional organizations. Both emerged in the Cold War era. Both were designed by post-colonial states that were deeply protective of sovereignty. Both rejected supranational authority. Neither was built around enforcement or adjudication. And yet, ASEAN has survived multiple crises, and yet SAARC has struggled to even convene their basic summits. If we have a look at when the last SAARC summit was supposed to happen, 2016, we've never had that. We did have something during COVID, however, again, that was very bleak. So the core question that I wanted to look at was, why does SAARC avoid disputes while ASEAN survives them? Both prioritize sovereignty, both reject supranational authority. However, only one absorbs the conflicts institutionally. And we know the answer to that, which regional organization that would be, ASEAN. So to understand this, we need to understand SAARC's foundational design. And for this, I'm looking at the SAARC Charter, specifically Article 10.2. So if we have a look at SAARC's foundational document of the SAARC Charter, and Article 10.2, and I've copy-pasted this directly, we see it says general provisions. 1, decisions at all levels shall be taken on the basis of unanimity. Again, another difference between SAARC and ASEAN, but I'm not going into that one for today. But the second, bilateral and contentious issues shall be excluded from deliberations. This is mentioned within SAARC's foundational document itself, that any bilateral or contentious issues shall be excluded from deliberations entirely from the regional organization. For this, we need to understand the history. And apologies, there are a lot of slides over here, but I will try to get through them as fast as possible as well. So if we have a look at the history of SAARC's Article 10.2, this was part of a broader design for it, and there were 4 reasons for 10.2 to actually be incorporated into SAARC from the start itself. The first was to prevent India-Pakistan tensions from actually overwhelming multilateral cooperation. The second was to protect technical and economic collaboration from political shocks. The third was it was expected to create trust incrementally through non-controversial engagement. And the fourth was to try to keep SAARC more technocratic rather than political. And so there was a lot of fear within the member states of how SAARC would what SAARC would become, and hence it was decided that Article 10.2 would be included. And this was a decision, if you have a look at the third paragraph, that was taken by President Ziaur Rahman, President of Bangladesh at that time, because they wanted to exclude controversial and bilateral issues from the ambit of SAARC, so that all of the nations would actually come together. So it was designed as confidence building. It reflected that there is deep political mistrust. And so it aimed to depoliticize cooperation and only focus on other non-political factors. However, of course, as we look at this, the solution itself becomes a problem because this stabilizing mechanism became a structural constraint. SAARC became an institution that only functioned in moments of calm, which in itself is a huge issue. And that is something that has been criticized by many critics, saying that this actually hampered the regional organization more than it actually benefited them. So, yes. Basically, everything mentioned over here is what the critics talk about, saying that contentious issues have been banned by the SAARC Charter, something that has damaged the organization more than it has actually benefited them. So, we see that within SAARC, this has actually damaged it more, where avoidance has turned to silence, silence has turned to irrelevance, and irrelevance has led to summits collapse, and we haven't had any SAARC summits happen after that. Now, when I bring in this comparison, there is this myth that is usually used that ASEAN is often invoked as a contrast, saying that we should just look at it comparatively and that everything that has happened in ASEAN has been quite easy. But we need to understand that even ASEAN is not conflict-free. ASEAN has also experienced a lot of territorial disputes. It has seen a lot of maritime standoffs. It has seen a lot of internal humanitarian crises, as well as regime instability. We can take the two examples that we have right now of the South China Sea, as well as the conflict that's going on in Myanmar. We see that the difference is not an absence of conflict in ASEAN. It's the way that they have coped with this through the institution, as well as Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, etc. There are many conflicts within ASEAN. So it's not that ASEAN is conflict-free. It is how ASEAN has looked at these conflicts and said that disputes are inevitable. However, this should not lead to institutional collapse. And so ASEAN never assumed that the disputes must be resolved before cooperation could occur. They said that disputes will always be there, but that should not lead to the institution collapsing. And that is the core insight that we can see from ASEAN over here. And apart from this, if we have a look, ASEAN's real innovation has been the way in which ASEAN has looked at these disputes, which is managing disputes without actually resolving them. Informality over legalism and the process over outcomes. Basically, what we're looking at is the ASEAN way, which is a huge difference that we see between SAARC and ASEAN. And when we look at the ASEAN way, it's characterized by non-interference, not non-engagement, and quiet diplomacy or golf diplomacy or sport shirt diplomacy, whatever way that we want to talk about this. And over here, I also want to bring up this point that the ASEAN way is often caricatured as being weak or indecisive, but then we misunderstand the function that the ASEAN way has. ASEAN privileges informality because informality reduces that political cost of engagement. And that is why it has been beneficial. It relies on informal consultations and they have meetings despite disagreements. And that has been really beneficial for ASEAN, as we can see. And this is one of the clearest contrasts that would be there between the two regional organizations. ASEAN meets even during crises. They meet even when the relations are strained. Meetings are not rewards for good behavior. They are tools for managing bad behavior. However, SAARC summits are cancelled due to disputes. ASEAN uses meetings to contain tensions. And as we see, ASEAN meets even when those relations are strained. The summit functions as pressure valves, not as celebrations. SAARC does the opposite. It has allowed bilateral disputes to actually veto multilateral engagements, turning summits into casualties rather than stabilizers. So, if we have a look at both of the institutional logics, SAARC has conflict avoidance, However, ASEAN has conflict containment. SAARC looks at legal exclusion through Article 10.2. ASEAN looks at informal engagement. SAARC cancels summits. ASEAN has a continuity in its summits. It has not cancelled any such summits. And now the core miscalculation over here for SAARC is that SAARC assumed that the silence produces stability. ASEAN assumed that engagement produces restraint. And the difference over here lies in the institutional imagination of this. Now, SAARC's core miscalculation was that assuming silence produces stability. However, silence actually produces fragility. So what should we do in this regard? Should we remove Article 10.2? Would that be the solution for this? Because if we have a look at the ASEAN Charter or any of ASEAN's legal documents, we don't have anything quite as similar as 10.2 in Southeast Asia. So to have the ASEAN way contrast or to have something similar to the ASEAN way, should we actually remove Article 10.2 from the Charter? Now, from whatever I've said so far, and this is something that I usually use in my classes. So I've started using memes in classes because I think it helps with the engagement as well. So let's say I started by criticizing 10.2 because it has not worked really well. Then I compared it with ASEAN and ASEAN way, and we see that it has actually worked. But my solution over here is saying that we should not change Article 10.2. It's not about removing Article 10.2 from the Charter. And let me take some time to explain why I say this. I say this because Article 10.2 has been used as a political choice, not a legal prison. Article 10.2 does not prohibit dialogue, apologies. It prohibits formal agenda setting. What ASEAN has done through its informal way of diplomacy is not something if SAARC would have done, it would have been blocked by Article 10.2. Creating informal spaces for engagement without actually amending the Charter is something that is possible without even removing this specific provision. So what Article 10.2 actually says is that bilateral and contentious issues shall be excluded from deliberations. What does that mean? Legally speaking, three things it says. First, it restricts formal agenda setting for summits. Second, it applies to official deliberations. Third, it does not prohibit dialogue, consultation, or engagement outside of that formal agenda setting. So what it does not do is, it does not ban informal discussions. It does not prevent side meetings or retreats. It does not prohibit confidence building measures. It does not prohibit track 1.5 or quiet mediation. It does not stop technical or sectoral cooperation from continuing during political crises. So, in other words, it is an agenda rule, not a gag order over here. And so, what we have seen is that over time, Article 10.2 has been treated as a political veto. Governments use it to justify cancelling summits. However, that is not a legal necessity if we read through the Charter in its legal sense. That is a political decision that is made by them. And as I mentioned, ASEAN has no equivalent exclusion clause over here. However, ASEAN usually avoids these sensitive issues. And SAARC, by contrast, it has turned this into a legal silence, which has then led to an institutional paralysis. And it is not because of 10.2 that summits are not happening. It's because these political actors prefer non-engagement and they justify it through 10.2. And I believe that removing this could also be counterproductive. Why I say this is because it could trigger immediate resistance from the member states, especially India and Pakistan, because if we look historically, they were the ones who wanted to include this within the Charter. It could raise fears among smaller states of bilateral domination or even reopen foundational anxieties that made SAARC possible in the first place. So it could be a high-cost reform with uncertain gains. And as mentioned, we don't actually need to have this change in the charter to have institutional reform. If we have a look at ASEAN, its success lies in precisely working around those rigid rules and not rewriting it every time there is a shift. And so the question is not should Article 10.2 be removed, but it would be how much institutional life exists despite Article 10.2. And so over here, again, why I'm talking about an ASEAN comparison to this, I'm not saying that ASEAN, SAARC should replicate ASEAN wholesale. But what I am saying is that SAARC can learn from ASEAN. What can we learn? Dispute management does not require dispute adjudication. ASEAN does not do dispute adjudication, as we know. ASEAN never insisted on formally resolving disputes inside the institution. It has not done so in most of the cases. Instead, it kept its meetings going on. They've had informal dialogue. They've used their ambiguity strategically and prioritized institutional continuity. If you even have a look at most of the ASEAN agreements, which I've done quite a bit of research on and I also teach about in my courses, most of their agreements are non-binding soft law agreements, as we call in international law terms, soft law. So there is a lot of ambiguity that are there in those agreements as well. And SAARC can do all of this without even touching Article 10.2. However, what we see is that they justify it through Article 10.2. And so what we see in South Asia is that legal texts are often treated as immovable political boundaries, while in Southeast Asia, we see that they are treated more as frameworks within which diplomacy happens. And so most of the states hide behind Article 10.2 whenever there are difficult conversations that need to be taken. And so this is not a legal failure. There is no need to change the legal framework. It's a political one. So the real obstacle now over here for SAARC lies in its domestic politics. Why reform has not happened, why SAARC still struggles mainly is because one of the reasons, of course, not the only reason, but the asymmetry between India and Pakistan. It shapes every institutional decision. The reason why the 2016 summit did not happen was because of India-Pakistan conflicts. And domestic audiences usually punish compromise. Leaders fear appearing weak. However, if we have a look at Southeast Asia, we see that leaders are willing to absorb these short-term criticism for long-term stability. South Asia has quite lacked in that. Low tolerance for ambiguity. And now, despite all of this, I would caution against declaring SAARC as irrelevant, as most of the scholars do. And this is a question that comes up all the time whenever I look at SAARC, which is, why even look at SAARC at this point in time? What's the point of me even looking at SAARC agreements at Article 10.2 if it's already a dead organization, or when there are other alternatives like BIMSTEC? And over here, there are a lot of things that can be said, but the main one is that SAARC has not been replaced, and it cannot be replaced by other organizations such as, let's say, BIMSTEC or other minilateral, by minilateralism. Minilateralism can supplement regionalism, but it can't replace it, because even though BIMSTEC has very specific areas that it looks into, the major point of minilateralism is that it rather avoids conflicts rather than resolves them. And there is that underlying problem that it works by excluding difficult actors. And in the long run, if we have a look at South Asia, we see that most of its challenges of migration, climate change, public health, data regulation, etc., are region-wide, and the absence of a forum can have quite huge consequences for it. And so BIMSTEC can't be seen as a substitute over here. Minilateralism can't replace regionalism, and South Asia is deeply interconnected. And so even if there are minilateral forums like BIMSTEC, it can supplement SAARC, but it cannot replace SAARC entirely. And so the absence of a regional platform over here imposes real costs, particularly for the smaller states. And so the choice facing South Asia is quite a stark choice right now, which is if it avoids disputes, it will lead to an institutional death. Or if it manages disputes, it could lead to regional survival. And the choice is not that easy, but I mean, it is an unavoidable one now because we are at that point where it needs to look at this. And so I just wanted to say that ASEAN has survived not because Southeast Asia is more harmonious, it's because it accepted that harmony is not a prerequisite for cooperation. And so there are quite a few things that we can learn from ASEAN. And at least in my understanding, I believe that even if we start by convening the SAARC summits, the relevancy of SAARC will drastically change, and we will start to see that increase in the relevancy for the regional organization over there. And so, yes, it learned to accept that harmony is not a prerequisite for cooperation. Until SAARC internalizes this lesson, South Asian regionalism will remain hostage to conflicts it refuses to acknowledge. And I think I'll leave it at that, and I'll open myself to questions or comments. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much. That was a very sharp argument, and I think because it was a sharp argument, it will evoke a lot of response. So I'll withhold my questions for now. I will just, because clearly people are already thinking. So Ronaja, if you could start us off.
Yeah, I had a quick question. I know, of course, the relevance of SAARC when SAARC is dead is, a common point of view or argument, call it what you will. But there is also this other formulation, and of course, you mentioned, the sub-regional groupings like BIMSTEC, etc. So people like scholars like Professor Raja Mohan, who's associated with our institute, has made this argument of SAARC -1, and of course the one being Pakistan, right? So you kind of cut out Pakistan from the picture, and things seem sort of better. So do you agree that is one way to go forward? Of course, you can't change geography or neighbors, so Pakistan still remains part of the neighborhood as part of the grouping. But is that something that is viable, you think, or not?
Yeah.
Thank you. I have something to say close to what Ronaja said. What about a SAARC -1, where the -1 is India? It seems to me that the big elephant in the room is that India is so big, and everybody is scared to be eaten up by India. So it isn't maybe in India the root cause, but does it make sense to have a regional organization without a major country in the region? A second question is, have you compared SAARC with the EU when it was funded, which was also made of 6 countries, 2 of which had killed each other for much of history, and they had stopped killing each other 3-4 years before the foundation of the EU. I don't know the answer, but do you know what was the trick that made it function way better than SAARC in that case?
Ivan?
Well, Diego kind of took much of my question, but fundamentally, one can ask whether South Asia can have actually a regional organization which is functional, because the fundamental contradiction is that South Asia is one huge country which is very dominant and several relatively small countries. Even Pakistan is not even vaguely comparable to India. Before 71, you can argue that it was. So in a certain sense, one way is either for other countries to accept Indian dominance, which obviously they wouldn't, or at least they wouldn't easily do so. The other option is to expand the region actually, to include extra-regional actors. For example, the Chinese have been flirting with such a thing. Some people even have claimed that they were trying to offer a trade-off to India. If India lets them into SAARC, they'll let India into SCO. That was many years ago. Obviously, it didn't work that way. But fundamentally, how do you see squaring this circle? Because it's very much a circle and it needs to be squared. Can the region actually be expanded to create kind of a different setup? Because ASEAN didn't have such a dominant country. You can argue that Indonesia was more powerful than other countries, but nothing vaguely comparable to India. Thank you.
Let me just tack on a little bit of an observation on both these points about BIMSTEC being conceived as SAARC minus Pakistan, and the fact that perhaps the problem is not India-Pakistan conflict, but India, which is to make the obvious observation that BIMSTEC has also been around since 1997. It's not like they have achieved much. I mean, except for a lot of the more summits than SAARC, but otherwise pretty much the same situation in terms of the dysfunction. So without Pakistan also, it doesn't seem like it has really worked. So perhaps there are alternative explanations that have already come here of what's wrong with the regionalism problem here.
Okay. So thank you so much for the questions. Quite interconnected questions as well, I believe, because when I'm looking at these, except for SAARC EU, because unfortunately I have not looked at the comparison of SAARC and EU and the historical aspect that you're talking about yet. But the other questions that you're talking about, I see a huge connection, and which comes to the question of regionalism and why regionalism is important for South Asia. So I believe that regionalism is quite important for South Asia because all the nations are quite interconnected, and most of the issues that the region faces is not specific by country, it's more transboundary in nature. So to give you an example, if we look at most of the major issues that we have in South Asia, climate change, river management, glacial melt, floods, heat waves, air pollution, where a lot of environment related that I've looked into, but there might be many more than that. Let's take migration, pandemics, disaster response. All of these are transboundary in nature and not something that one nation in itself can actually counter. India can't do this by itself, same as how, let's say, in a SAARC -1, if Pakistan is not there, I believe that we would be kind of taking away from it, because for the entire region and for all of these nations, I believe that this regionalism provides it coordination, data sharing, and also early warning mechanisms. And so I believe that a SAARC -1, even though this is something that I had thought of as well last May 2025, when the entire issue came up, it's still not something that would be feasible because of all of these issues that are more transboundary in nature. And so a SAARC -1 would not be possible if we remove Pakistan or even India, especially India, because if we have a look at the map, India is literally in the middle of all of this. And so it is quite important and crucial for the regional organization, and also for all of the smaller nations as well. And now coming to India and Indonesia, this is something that I'd looked at when I wanted to understand what India can learn from Indonesia. And that won't actually answer the question over here. And I'm so sorry, I'm kind of getting sidetracked by the question. Could you just repeat?
Well, it was more of a comment than a question. Fundamentally, my question was, isn't this the structural, that is the structure of South Asia prevents regionalism? So one option would be to expand the region. And I want to stress here, not by including China, because, well, we all know what will happen then. But is there a way to kind of change the framework to prevent this structural factor from kind of obstructing regionalism?
Honestly, I don't think that, first of all, there is no way that the region can be decreased, as a lot of people would think. One of the reasons how we see BIMSTEC as a possibility by many scholars, saying that we remove Pakistan and remove Afghanistan and be able to do it. I believe that because of those transboundary nature issues and concerns, it's not possible to remove. Addition as well, there is no place for addition over here as well. If you have a look at the map again, we're talking about China. I don't think China would fit into this at all from any way in the geographical sense as well as no other nation from any other side. So there is no chance of an addition to this regional organization as well. If it is to work, it is to work with these 8 nations itself. And again, it could be SAARC, it could be successor to SAARC. However, I believe that it is SAARC that should be taken forward rather than even considering another regional organization or other minilateral organizations combined to create something similar to SAARC over here.
Yeah, but just let me jump in a little bit, but let me just push you a little bit on this idea that it has to be these 8 countries. I mean, even if you think about transboundary issues, because geography, how many of those transboundary issues are unique or common for all 8 countries always together? I mean, there's a pollution issue between Pakistan and India, or there's a border issue and all that. But I don't think that has much effect on, say, the eastern side of Bhutan. I mean, Bhutan doesn't get involved with that. Or the other way of conceiving it is like including Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, or some other country, or China. I mean, it's an upper riparian, has a lot of common rivers and all sorts of connection to this region, right? I mean, regions are constructed ideas and they can be constructed in whatever way you want. And we have seen in the last 20th century that people have had all sorts of permutation combination of how they think about region. It doesn't have to be just a particular, that this is South Asia. And so I'm not sure how much there's one unique transboundary issue which affects all 8 together and has to be something that brings all of them together, or is there multiple transboundary issues and which can be some bit separated? But please, Pushpa.
Thank you, Sandeep. I think I just wanted to thoughts on that, and perhaps it will be a good connection. On the regional issues, I think you rightly said, perhaps there are no issues so far that involves all 8 countries together, for which they all have to sit together to resolve it. And what we have seen is that in case of conflicts so far, India has taken a bilateral approach with most of the countries around, right? And so India thinks that bilateral approach is the best way to go forward. That's what we have seen. So for a large country like India, and as you also said that if you look at a map, without India, the other countries can't function, because I think I had said this earlier as well, even if Nepal would want to cooperate with Bangladesh on energy trade or even merchandise trade, it has to be through India. So without India, there's no cooperation even among the other countries. So I think discounting India and thinking about SAARC perhaps is just not feasible. And that large country, India, when it thinks about resolve these conflicts bilaterally, perhaps doesn't make it compelled to go for a regional kind of a cooperation. That's why I think we have seen that cooperation has lagged in SAARC, right? That's one. The other one is in terms of Charter 10.2, the legal aspect of it, as you said, that conflicts are not to be deliberated in SAARC, but it doesn't stop countries from bringing in conflict for informal kind of an engagement on that. I think that is the problem, perhaps, right? Not the countries which are in conflict in within SAARC, particularly, they don't want even the informal discussion to take place over there, because they have always been saying that it's a bilateral issue. India doesn't want any of the conflict with Pakistan to be brought neither to SAARC nor to any other multilateral forum. It has always been saying it's a bilateral kind of a conflict battle issue that they will solve for themselves. So whether we have 10.2 over there and then defined it in a different way or explained different way, or whether we remove it from there, the very essence of SAARC, as you I think rightly said, that perhaps the idea was not to get SAARC involved into domestic politics and bilateral conflicts, but then to take this regional organization as a technocratic kind of a platform to advance development in the region has not taken place in the first place. So I think the failure has already been there, and then the reasons for why this has not gone forward perhaps is something that might be difficult to achieve even without having 10-2 over there, or still having 10-2 over there. And especially in the current moment now, it's not only India and Pakistan, right? Now we are looking at the kind of conflict we are seeing, domestic conflict within the countries. India getting into these conflicts as well. So all this perhaps points to, yes, as scholars and who have been working regional cooperation, we all want regionalism in SAARC to succeed, and we want that to go forward. Set aside all the conflicts, at least take the development and regional other issues forward. But yeah, I think to me, I see this as a very pessimistic kind of a scenario for SAARC to go forward anytime further. But then I don't know, you might have a different take on 10-2 from the legal background, but that's how I was seeing it. Because when they don't want that to be brought in the first place, whether formal, informal, I don't know whether interpreting it differently might make a difference.
I'm just going to share Dr. Pushpa's pessimism here because just an add-on question. Given that there is a huge difference in the capabilities and clearly one country has surpassed the others, and that would create some sort of friction always, and the conflicts being so deep rooted and bilateral approach seems to be how things are running between these countries. So in that sense, this question is something about the observation that you made about SAARC not being replaced. So whether SAARC was not replaced or whether there was no interest or scope in replacing it or reviving it in the first place. So I would just like to know your thoughts on that. Thank you.
And Shivan wants to jump up.
Thank you. By the way, referring to what Diego said about the comparison with the European Union, it in many ways started actually as an economic community, European steel and coal community. So in a certain sense, aren't we just putting the cart before the horse? One can argue that if they focus on economic cooperation, even very narrow economic cooperation, then they wouldn't need to deal with many of those very complex political issues. And then over time, maybe they will start to develop some type of political partnership, political regionalism. But first, it has to go through the economic path, and probably a very narrow economic path, which means kind of economic cooperation on issues on which they can really cooperate, as opposed to kind of divisive issues like water, for example. Thank you.
Okay. Let me see where I can start this from. So the first one that I've noted here was, yes. I'll get to all the questions one by one. So apologies if I'm not going in order. But the first one that I see over here was bilateral issues. Why take up a regional forum when bilateralism is basically how you can take it forward? And the major criticism over here that we could see, or the major concern that we can see, is that if issues are taken up bilaterally, then there is this huge possibility of there being not only power asymmetries, but it could also attract external involvement, which we have seen in South Asian issues coming up. Informal discussion does not require formal agenda inclusion. And so I believe that SAARC can take up these issues to try to exclude this external involvement that we see, which usually we see of China. And to take the example over here again, if we have a look at how Chinese involvement has been with respect to Southeast Asia, we don't see China actually taking up bilateral issues over here. If we have a look at any of the issues that have happened in Southeast Asia, it's taken up as a region and China rather than it being one country and China. Because if that happens, then there could be that possibility of an asymmetry. And if we have a look at why this is important of having this regional organization, I think that kind of ties up with both of your questions. It kind of is related to power asymmetry, and also that the greatest losers of having the SAARC paralysis is the smaller states, because not only are they losing out from having a regional forum where they might have an equal say and kind of remove this power asymmetry, but also that it amplifies their voice, and they can also push for certain reforms within the region. When we have a look at why it has to be these specific 8 countries, and when we tie that up with the transnational issues or transboundary issues of why is it only these 8 countries when there is no issue that has impacted all 8 of these countries together. If we have a look at most of the environmental issues, at least, and I can speak more towards them because that is what I've majorly taught and done research on, we do see that most of these environmental issues do creep into some of these interconnected countries. It's not always the same India or Pakistan, or let's say Nepal or India. It would be a specific part of the region itself. And so if we have a look at, let's say, when was this? 2019's hurricane, I think it was, which was towards Bangladesh, India. So we would see that there were specific countries over there that were affected. If we have a look at when the earthquakes happened in Nepal, then we'd see India, Nepal, and this side being affected. So we would see a connection of certain of these countries being affected by all of these environmental issues. We would not see any of these other, let's say, after 8 countries that would have been affected by this. So it makes more sense for these 8 countries to be there because of this interconnectedness. Doesn't mean that it's always going to be those 8 countries that are affected by every single issue, but it would be a mix and match of some of those countries that would be affected by this. And so that's why I believe that it is these countries that need to form the regional organization, and which is why SAARC being the answer for this. There was something else that I'd written somewhere. Let me see if I can figure this out. India and SAARC. I think this was mentioned somewhere I'm not exactly remembering the framing of the question, but I remember it being about India and its appetite for SAARC, let's say. I believe that even though India is not really interested in SAARC right now, there will always come a time in regional organizations where nations respond to incentives, costs and incentives. And for India, SAARC offers the regional stability, economic growth, and countering China's influence. It offers that platform for trade. It offers that platform for infrastructure connectivity and cultural cooperation. So it will be in India's best interests, of course, that it would want to revive SAARC, while it will also be in the interests of the smaller nations to not take up issues bilaterally so that there is no power asymmetry. And so they would also want there to be a regional organization where they can amplify their voices as well as push for certain procedural reforms. And so a regional organization is important for them as well. So I feel like from both sides, there is an importance for a regional organization, and that one so far is SAARC, in my understanding. If I've missed out on something, please do let me know. I think I've missed out on your question.
What about economics? And shouldn't they start with economics instead?
Oh, yes. Sorry, yes. So I remember reading this just yesterday somewhere, that the major difference between ASEAN and SAARC actually has been that ASEAN started with political cooperation, which then led to economic cooperation, while SAARC actually went the opposite way. They started with economic cooperation and they thought that that would lead to political cooperation. However, we see that it did not actually lead to political cooperation. It led to the opposite, where as soon as there was any disputes, they just decided to end any discussions at all. And so just to look at that point, it's very interesting to see how both of these regional organizations have actually done it the different way. Worked for one, the other one, because of the addition of Article 10.2, they kind of use that as a legal barrier, saying that no, because there is this difference in opinion over here, because there is this issue that we have ongoing, we would want to stop our cooperation entirely. And so I don't think economic cooperation would lead to political cooperation. It has to be the opposite way around, where there needs to be political cooperation. And once there is political cooperation and nations are actually open to looking at what mistakes they're making, then only that could lead to any other form of cooperation, including economic cooperation. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting and covering quite a number of issues on which there is very limited discussion. So thank you for sharing those insights. I had two questions by way of just a clearer understanding. One is that as far as a legal framework is concerned, how powerful is the SAARC with respect to its constituent members, in the sense that if the SAARC suggests something by way of a charter, does it hold? As far as my knowledge goes, please correct me if I am wrong, looking at it from the ASEAN perspective, I think the ASEAN Charter is also not overpowering. But there's this point that you mentioned, which is an absolutely correct point, that there is a view within ASEAN that let's not push this to the dispute unless it is absolutely essential. So to that extent, the ASEAN framework actually looks legally much stronger than what the law empowers it to be. So is there something similar in SAARC, or is there totally just an absence of political will or collective will in that regard? That's the first thing I wanted to check. The second, what I wanted to inquire from you, just looking ahead a little forward, ASEAN as a body has engaged in far more extensive and ASEAN plus regional mechanisms, including the East Asia Summit, including in many other forums. Now, that has been completely absent from South Asia as such, and obviously SAARC hasn't moved. Is it because there is a huge amount of imbalance within the SAARC compared with ASEAN, both economically and strategically? What I mean to say is that India's willingness or unwillingness, whichever way one looks at it, does decide whether the SAARC is going to move in a particular direction or not, or can move in a particular direction or not. That heterogeneity is much less pronounced within ASEAN. I mean, much as Singapore is the most powerful economy, Indonesia's strategic heft is unquestionably large. So is Malaysia's. And perhaps the LDCs get greater weightage within the ASEAN framework as opposed to the SAARC framework. So there's probably some sort of a contradiction in the appetite for regionalism in South Asia. That's my sense. And please correct me if I'm wrong. Thank you.
And just to add on to that, I mean, the ASEAN +3 and East Asia Summit, a lot of these were because there was a genuine need felt for doing something more, and their ASEAN has this agenda. They don't always realize, but there's clearly an agenda to do something. Sometimes it feels like SAARC is more performative. There's not really an appetite to do things. It's more like we should have a charter, we should have blue economy because blue economy is popular, and have all these issues because that's what a regional organization does.
And just to add a small point to that, Sandeep, unlike the EU, which is often taken as the benchmark for measuring ASEAN's, ASEAN is not a customs union, unlike the EU, which is very watertight and very integrated in that respect, with respect to the currency and a number of other factors. So, I mean, again, I come back to that first point. ASEAN actually looks much tighter, solid, and bigger than what it is legally. It's just because the members come together collectively to give it a much greater spirit of cohesion and cooperation, as opposed to SAARC. Thank you.
Should I go ahead?
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. Thank you for the questions. So first one, legal framework, how strong is the charter? And when we look at the ASEAN Charter, the framework looks much stronger. So if we actually have a look at the ASEAN Charter as well as the SAARC Charter, we won't actually see much of a difference because both of these documents, which would be the major documents for both the regional organizations, they are very binding in nature. And the bindingness of the document is seen through three specific heads in international law. That is seen through, and let me see if I can remember exactly the three things. First one is the language itself of the document. The second one is the specificness of the provisions. And the third one is the adjudication that is done by the adjudication of any contravention to the provisions. So for the first two heads, which is your language of the document as well as your specificity of the document, the SAARC Charter as well as the ASEAN Charter, both are tick marks for that, saying that the SAARC Charter as well as ASEAN Charter have very hard law binding terms used, that the nations shall do this. The nations shall do this. That's there. It's very specific in its nature as well as to what all they have to do. However, it's the third aspect where both of these regional organizations fall apart, which is the adjudication and the adjudicatory body. ASEAN does not have an adjudicatory body, so much so that SAARC does not have an adjudicatory body. And so if we have a look at both of these frameworks, they both are 2 out of 3 on the scale of soft law and hard law. It's that if there ever is a contravention, ASEAN does not have any body to oversee it, saying that, okay, this is the issue that has come up and this is what should be done. SAARC also does not have that. Contrastingly, as you took the example of EU has that. And that is one of the major differences between the European Union as well as these Asian regional organizations, as well as, I think, something that I'd mentioned at the start as well of the presentation, that there is a huge difference between SAARC, ASEAN, and other institutions, which is the supranational authority, which is there for EU in the European Court of Human Rights, as well as their other adjudicatory bodies, which is not there in SAARC and ASEAN. So coming back to how strong we see SAARC Charter and ASEAN Charter, interestingly, both of them are on the same level over there, where they meet 2 out of 3 of these things. It's just about what happens when there is a nation that contravenes one of those provisions. What does the regional organization do? And they don't take it to court. ASEAN manages it internally. SAARC does nothing at all with respect to it, because again, coming back to Article 10.2, they say that we will not adjudicate on this because this has now become a contentious issue for us. And so it is more of the functioning of the regional organization rather than the framework that would be different for both of these regional organizations. The second question with respect to, is there more imbalance in SAARC, and then an appetite for regionalism, where you even took the example of how for Southeast Asia, East Asia Summit, etc., etc. I honestly think that India does have the appetite for regionalism. If you have a look at India and everything that is done with all of its neighboring countries bilaterally, as well as all of the other regional organizations or international organizations that it has been a part of, especially when I was doing research about this just a few months back, India is part of, I think, 14 or so international organizations or regional organizations, including as an observer state or other roles in many of these other regional organizations. I do believe that India does have that appetite for regionalism. It does see benefits of actually maintaining good relations with its neighbor states. It's just that it's not seeing that right now through SAARC, which again, I believe that it's more of not whether it sees it and whether it should leave, but when will it see it and when will it start actually working towards this specific regional organization and when it will respond to it. So I believe that there is that case to be made that India does see benefits from regional organizations as well as its neighboring states. It's just that it's not saying that through the regional organization yet. I hope that answers the second question, because that's what I've written down over here. Otherwise, I'd be happy to clarify again.
So let me just use the privilege of the moderator that I forgo earlier about just plugging in a couple of questions.
Yeah.
One is, could you just give us a couple of examples of when Article 10.2 was invoked and how it actually functions, rather than just being in the charter, but how does it actually function, or how is it applied in practice? The other is a more methodological question from a researcher perspective, because with the problems of regionalism, one of the major challenge is to figure out what is the cause and what is the effect. Is not having a summit an effect of dysfunction or cause of dysfunction? Is 10.2 an effect of dysfunction or cause of dysfunction? How do you think about that? And how do you figure? I mean, I struggle with it a lot. So I would like some pointers on how do you think about identifying what are the causes and how do you order those causes? And the third is just thinking about, because we have mentioned this several times now, that India is the biggest actor, most important actor in this whole story. Thinking about how India's geographical conception exists, because I feel like to a certain degree, India is moving away from, I mean, I don't think it's firm, but moving away from the conception of South Asia as a joint idea. I think there's some way of thinking about geography in terms of AFPAC as a separate region, BBIN as a separate region, right? I mean, and thinking about them collaborating somewhere. And then what India has now taken to call broadly as Indian Ocean, which is basically Maldives and Mauritius and Sri Lanka and these islands together, right? And thinking about them as a different region and having different policies for them. So perhaps, I mean, there's a different regional conception at play. So even if India is sold to regionalism, it doesn't have to translate into SAARC, but a different way of thinking about regions.
Okay. So very interestingly, how Article 10.2 actually functions. Very interesting. You don't actually see a lot of research about SAARC, and no one will actually say that we are evoking Article 10.2. How this usually happens is that whenever there is a dispute amongst nations, and the clearest example that we can see of this would have been the SAARC summit, 2016 one, is that whenever there is an issue between two nations, which was then India, Pakistan, and the entire URI issue that happened, they said that we would not be coming to the table now because of these issues. And implicitly, Article 10.2 was evoked. So there is no such formal recognition saying that Article 10.2 is being invoked. It's more of it being implied over there that the summit is not happening because of this reason, which is contentious, and hence it is a barrier. And hence that is why I said that it's not a legal invocation as much as it's a political one over there. Not having a summit, is it an effect or a cause? Now, I honestly believe that if a summit were to happen, and if they were held regularly, as we see in ASEAN, if they were held regularly, regardless of the political tensions, the institution in itself would regain relevance quite immediately itself. And so I believe that dialogue does not require an agreement. It just requires the presence of the countries over there. And so it is an effect or a cause. Article 10.2 has led to the cause of there not being a summit. But if there were summits happening, I believe that regionalism in itself would immediately start to show its relevance in South Asia. India moving away, it's sold, but it's not translating to SAARC. Again, just coming back to the same point. I believe that India has a couple of issues with SAARC. The first one that it had was that it thought that the other nations were ganging up on it. it thought that there are certain security concerns as well. However, I think from the Indian perspective, it needs to recognize as well that they don't need to compromise on their core security concerns over here. It just needs to recognize that this regional absence creates a vacuum, and that SAARC as well as South Asia is a very important region for it for economic growth, and also to continue countering the Chinese influence in most of these countries. And so while it is sold on regionalism and it's not translating into SAARC, it will sooner or later realize the importance of SAARC. And that is why I was talking about how right now it might not be realizing it, but then over time, the incentives that the regional organization has is something that might just become clearer for the regional, for the nation.
Sorry, I know we don't have much time. Just to bring some points together. So globally, we have this kind of pushback against or like an invalidation of a rules-based order. So that's happening in real time. And then like Dr. Pushpa was saying, when we look at the domestic countries, so the domestic politics of South Asian countries, a lot of what the protests are really saying is that institutions don't really hold as much in these countries. Even as there's a demand for stronger institutions, it's really a delegitimization of institutions, and politics is more surrounding personalities within these countries. And so when you put those two things together, and then when we look at the South Asian context, where usually reforms, either legal or institutional, have often followed external pressure. So whether it's the IMF or whether it's Quad, for example. So the only time we have a kind of working institutional framework, I would argue, is when the geopolitical interests of the big powers plus India come into South Asia and then they form the Quad. In this context where power politics is really the dominant force, I'm being pessimistic about SAARC not only because of India, but because of the kind of language of power politics in globally as well as in the region. Do you think that there would ever be any external pressure to have a forum such as a working functional SAARC? And I'm just thinking, for example, if an external player like the US or the EU sees that there's less benefit in negotiating with India and there's a need to bring down the kind of power differential of India, then would that be the kind of context in which an institution like SAARC would be strengthened? Yeah.
Sorry, there was money. Another organization where there is a big bully and a group of other smaller states that functions. I can think of NATO.
NAFTA.
NAFTA, yeah. NATO is another one, maybe. But you know, the other members just accepted the dominance and whatever the USA.
Have a parallel conversation on that, but I would totally dismiss the EU from the bulliness part.
Yeah, but there isn't a huge bully. I mean, there is
one huge.
Yeah, there are. That's the thing. There are a few. So they cancel each other.
South Asia is unparalleled.
Yeah. I mean, NATO, NAFTA, but
I mean, to be fair, just as a counterpoint is also, I know that all bullies are not created equal. I mean, India is to a certain degree regional hegemon, but there is also historically, you can make a case that, you know, it has to a certain degree exercises hegemony in certain degree with certain degree of self-restraint as compared to many other parts. Say South Africa and Southern Africa in till 80s exercised a much more coercive hegemony than India did. So, and that is also something to be considered, right, in terms of whatever little success there has been of South Asian regionalism, that not all bullies are the same.
Yeah.
Gulf Cooperation Council, by the way, with Saudi Arabia. Anyway,
Right.
Yes, okay. External players, whether if there is an external influence, can that actually lead to a betterment of the regional organization? Actually, if we have a look at the regional organization historically, the reason that the regional organization was created was because the US had certain, what do we call this? It had a certain fear that this entire region would be balkanized. And so there was that US influence that actually created the regional organization in the start, which is a very interesting way to now look at whether, if there is another external influence, would that actually lead to the betterment, which I'm actually not sure at this moment. At that moment, for the starting of the regional organization, while it made a lot of sense, for now, if there is any external influence, I'm not sure. I don't think that would actually help in the betterment of the region, because everyone would have their own interests in mind in such situations right now. Bullies, I mean, there will always be power asymmetries in any regional organization, any international organization. Every regional organization has a bully or bullies. It's not that all of them cancel each other out. There could be instances where there were many bullies, yet there were smaller countries that pushed for their agendas to be formed. I believe Southeast Asia would be an example where I think most of the smaller nations actually made the effort to have their agendas put forward. And they were even in contrast to most of the major nations during that time. I can't think of any other place where there's one individual country, but then I believe that it's the usual that every single organization will have certain countries that would be asymmetrical to the others. And there's no other way I can answer that, I guess.
But what I was suggesting,
Yes.
what are the mechanisms that made organization with one big powerful country
Mhm.
to function
Mhm.
vis-a-vis SAARC? Because so what can be learned from? I don't know. It's a genuine question about which I don't know anything about. That was the serious intent of my question.
So the serious intent of the question, now coming back to this, I believe that the regional organization in itself was formed so that the other nations have a say in whatever matters there were. Otherwise, before this, there wasn't much of that symmetry between the nations. So is there anything we can learn from SAARC and what has happened so far? Honestly, I think that I don't actually know. I'll have to think about that for a bit. Sorry. Maybe I'll think about that and get back to you. I'll take my time with that, I guess.
Well, I think thank you very much for a very incisive and a very different approach to this question of SAARC, which has been something that has plagued us for a very long time, but this is a very fresh approach to that. So it's a very interesting. And also, I'm really grateful for your optimism in face of all this pessimism that came out of this room about SAARC, and still staying optimistic about it is a very important, very necessary. Thank you very much. Thank you to Jordan, Yusuf, as always, for putting a flawless event together. And thank you everyone for coming.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.